So welcome to the Data World Friday. My name is Michael Olschimke. I'm the CEO of Scalefree. We have this session here every Friday, 11 o'clock Central European Standard Time, to allow you, the audience, to ask questions about data vaults, data-driven solutions, cloud solutions, cluster issues that you have, and so on. Yeah, you can use the chat here in the client to raise a question if you want. You can use the Q&A in the client. You can just raise your hand if you want for a live question, but you can also use a form which I show you after today's session. If you receive multiple questions, I would essentially cherry pick depending on my mood, or typically because of a let's say long-term series that I'm working on, and so on. It's time boxed, roughly 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes. That's a goal. If there will be no questions at all, we will talk about the cluster, and we're getting closer to it. All right, so ask questions, because I didn't do a lot on the cluster here. So today we received one question here. Let me just show it to you. That's essentially about the translation of the metadata. So the client here, they receive essentially data from a source, and the sources are non-English or different languages, and use a variety of languages for the metadata, for the table names, the column names, and so on. But for the raw data vault or for the data warehouse, everything should be in English because they have an international user audience, essentially. So where is the best spot, where's the best place to introduce the translation for the English as a target language? And there's a couple of options. So let's go through this layer by layer. And remember, in the previous sessions, I talked a lot about these. I mean, data vault is a data-driven solution, and that's how we model it. So my thinking is really about data flows. So the first step, when we ingest data from the source systems into a staging area, either a relational staging area or a data lake, which we typically use, I would stick to the original metadata from the source, just because it's easier to debug. So the relational staging area for sure, but even the data lake, I would keep as is, because translating the metadata takes some time as well, right? And I want to absorb as much data as possible. So I don't want to essentially spend much effort in the first step getting the data into our infrastructure. So I keep the original metadata as is. If it's Chinese or English or French, doesn't matter, German, and so on. Now you could argue on a data lake, what about the data scientists? Because they also want to use the data lake. And if it's in all kinds of different languages, that's a problem. I agree. But that's where we have virtual layers later for the data lake. So you typically use something like Athena or Impala, for example, Presto, and so on, Trino, to access the data lake. And that's where you could introduce view layers. So as soon as you know the translations for your incoming files, you would essentially introduce a view layer in English that accesses the data on the actual files, essentially. That way you can absorb the data immediately and later deliver the English metadata, even on data lake, a bit later, essentially. So that's number one, the first layer. Then we have the raw data vault layer, and that's where my preference is to translate everything into English, because the argument is that a power user can use the raw data vault. They are not limited to the information marts or to the business vaults. The business vault is a sparsely modeled layer. So to produce a dimension, you have to join entities from the raw data vault and the business vault typically. So they need access to the raw data vault, and power users, they want to use everything in English. So the raw data vault would be my first place where I would translate everything, but I would stick to as close as possible to the original names. Give an example: airplane and aircraft. Let's say you got two English source systems. One refers to aircraft as aircraft, the other one as airplanes. I would stick to that because the raw data vault is modeled closely to the source system, and I would stick to that, even on the metadata level. What I would do is I would extend these abbreviations a bit so they're more readable. Let's say one source system defines aircraft as AC. I would spell it out. It's an aircraft, not an airplane. It's aircraft, so, right? Because AC is the abbreviation for aircraft. So I would stick as close as possible to the source system. If it's in German, let's say SAP, for example, where you get both, you get German language and you get the abbreviations, I would essentially translate the metadata into longer English names, but as close as possible to the original German names, essentially. That's my goal. And then in the business vault, I would start standardizing the translation. So I would decide for either aircraft or airplane. I would essentially name the entities or the attributes, and then I would essentially standardized on the business world entities for the names, essentially. That's my preference, essentially. Users, they often also start standardizing the translations already in the raw data vault. That has some advantages because the power users might not know the source system very well, but actually the power users typically know the source system. So that's my counter argument, right? So it goes back and forth, and I agree. So it's really a bit fuzzy where you start standardizing the translations. In the raw data vault or in the business vault, both will work. And for the information marts, actually it depends again which language I would use. So typically the information marts are in English in most of the installations that we build, but it doesn't have to be. So you could also argue that a user from Germany needs a information mart, a dimension model in German with German dimension names, German attribute names, and so on. So the information mart could be in German as well, or French or Chinese and English and so on, right? Doesn't matter. So I would also be essentially open, I've never done it, to be honest, but would be open to translating an information mart into a different language on the metadata level. But typically customers, they stick to the language from the raw data vault and the business vault, essentially. But that's the idea. So that's where we would essentially translate the metadata typically, starting from the raw data vault, but sticking closer to the sources of metadata, and then standardizing it in the business vault, and especially in information, but it's all standardized, right? That's where we typically do it. Again, think about the data flows. You get these data flows coming in. First job is to absorb the data, and you don't want to spend much effort for it. So we do it as it arrives in the original metadata, in the original language of the metadata. And then with every step towards the target, every step downstream, we start to standardize more and more. First step is translation in English. Second step is to standardize the terminologies and so on. That's the idea. So that's the data flow that you're looking at, essentially. All right. Yeah, cool question. If you have a question like this, use this form here, https sfr.ee. Let me just double check if there's a question here. https sfr.ee/dbfriday. That's where you can essentially sign up or essentially send in questions to the system here. You can also check out the scalefree.to/webinars. I just forwarded one question on DBT. That was a question regarding the ingestion of JSON data into DBT systems, essentially, DBT-driven database systems. I just forwarded that to the DBT Tech Talk, so check it out there. It should come up in the next couple of sessions, essentially. And there's also a session for WebScape, so that's also interesting to check out. And we have the Data Dreamland coming up in October, on October 10 and 11. That's a great place to meet in person and shake hands. Yeah, would be nice if you can make it to Hanover, Germany, to come to the conference. Lots of interesting talks, vendors, customers, partners coming up and showing what they do with Data Vault. So it's really interesting. If you're interested in Data Vault, it's where you want to be. And then if in-person meetings are not for you, then we have for you the Data Vault Innovators essentially community. That's where we meet virtually, answer your questions or discuss on Data Vault and so on. That's also a great place to share some knowledge, where we move in also a lot of the content essentially to the Data Vault Innovators community, essentially. That's the idea. All right, cool. Lots of options for you to get in touch with us, to engage in a discussion. So yeah, go for one. Cool. Thanks for joining today. Hope your weather is better in here in Northern Germany. It's very rainy, and it should, we'll see how it goes. I believe I will work on the weekends. Best option, most probably. So cool. See you next Friday, 11 o'clock. And yeah, enjoy your weekend if you can. Thank you, guys.
Thanks for joining today. If you'd like to discuss this further, give us a call on the number below here, and we're happy to discuss this with you. See you next time. Have a nice weekend. Bye-bye.